The words arrived like uninvited guests, unannounced and unsettling, slipping through the digital crack of my morning email. They shimmered on the screen, their familiarity a cold shard against the warmth of my first coffee, a discordant note in the quiet symphony of my study. They were beautiful words, undeniably so, woven with a lyrical cadence that resonated deep in the marrow of my bones, painting vivid, aching pictures of whispering pines under a turquoise sky, of ancient spirits dancing in the dust devils of the high desert, of a resilience forged in the crucible of loss. They spoke of a connection to the land that was both fierce and tender, a language I knew intimately. They were, in essence, my words. Or rather, the ghosts of words, echoes of a voice I thought I'd buried with my youth, words I had once bled onto the page nearly 2 decades ago, in a small, raw, self-published collection of poems and short stories titled Whispers of the Ancestors. That little book, with its hand-drawn raven on the cover, had sold perhaps 200 copies, a handful at local craft fairs, the rest to supportive friends, indulgent family, and a few kind-hearted souls at community powwows who saw something of themselves in its unpolished yearning. But these words, these beautifully familiar, haunting echoes, were now attributed to another, to Elara Vance. The name alone tasted like ash in my mouth. Elara Vance, a name that had, in the preceding 3 or 4 years, ascended to the literary stratosphere with a speed that left seasoned critics breathless and marketing departments ecstatic. Her debut novel, Shadow Walker's Legacy, wasn't just a book. It was a cultural phenomenon, an international bestseller translated into 24 languages, lauded by the gatekeepers of literary taste for its achingly authentic Indigenous voice, its profound, almost spiritual insight into the Native American experience, and its courageous exploration of ancestral trauma and healing. Critics, it seemed, had queued up to lavish praise. Awards committees had practically tripped over themselves to shower her with accolades. Hollywood, predictably, was already in a frenzied bidding war for the film rights, envisioning a prestige drama that would sweep the Oscars. Elara Vance, with her artfully disheveled raven-black hair, was it dyed, I now wondered? Her signature turquoise jewelry that always seemed to catch the camera's light just so during interviews, and her carefully, almost tragically curated narrative of a distant, rediscovered Cherokee grandmother whose spirit supposedly guided her pen, was the literary world's new, incandescent darling. And Elara Vance, I was beginning to realize with a sickening, sinking dread, was a meticulously constructed fraud. My name is Dr. Althea Song Loya. I am Diné, a citizen of the Navajo Nation, born and raised on the res in the shadow of Shiprock where the wind carries stories older than any book. I am a tenured professor of Indigenous literatures and post-colonial studies at a university that, while respectable, is hardly Ivy League. I am a poet, a novelist, my own published works, a couple of well-received but modestly selling novels, a collection of academic essays, 3 volumes of poetry from reputable small presses, have garnered critical respect within certain circles. They've won a few regional awards, been taught in some university courses. They are a source of quiet, hard-won pride. But they have never achieved the commercial supernova status of Elara Vance. My stories are often quieter, perhaps more challenging, certainly less romanticized. I write about the messy, resilient, often contradictory realities of contemporary Indigenous life, the intergenerational trauma that clings like dust, the fierce, unexpected joy that erupts in the midst of struggle, the ongoing grinding fight for sovereignty, for self-determination, for the simple right to define ourselves in our own terms on our own land. My characters don't walk in shadows guided by mystical grandmothers. They navigate tribal council meetings, fight for clean water, teach their children their language against the relentless tide of assimilation, and grapple with the legacy of colonialism in ways that are far from cinematic. The email that morning, the one that had shattered my morning peace, was from a former graduate student, Anya Sharma, now a bright-eyed, underpaid intern at a prestigious East Coast literary magazine. Dear Dr. Loya, she'd written, her enthusiasm palpable even through the screen. I hope this email finds you well. I was rereading Elara Vance's latest interview in the Paris Review. Her insights are just incredible. and some of her descriptions of her creative wellspring and ancestral inspiration resonated so strongly with the concepts you explored in your Indigenous Poetics seminar. There was even a passage where she discussed the symbolism of the coyote that felt incredibly, almost uncannily similar to a section in your old chapbook, Whispers of the Ancestors, the one you so generously let us photocopy for class. I found my copy last night. Am I just imagining things, or is there a real echo there? Probably just my overactive literary brain. Anyway, thought you might find it interesting. All best, Anya. Imagining things. Oh, how I wished she were. I wished it could be dismissed as an intern's overactive imagination, a coincidental thematic resonance, the sort of Jungian synchronicity that sometimes occurs in the creative ether. I had, of course, been aware of Alara Vance. It was impossible for anyone in the literary world, especially anyone identifying as an Indigenous writer, not to be. Her face, often artfully pensive, graced the covers of magazines I myself subscribed to. Her voice, a carefully modulated contralto that hinted at unspoken sorrows and ancient wisdom, was a constant, celebrated presence on literary podcasts and public radio programs. I'd even forced myself to read Shadow Walker's Legacy some months prior, driven by a mixture of professional curiosity and a certain weary obligation. While I'd acknowledged its technical proficiency, the prose was polished, the pacing expert. Something about its vaunted authenticity had always felt profoundly off. It was like listening to someone recite perfectly enunciated phrases in a language they had learned by rote, but whose deeper rhythms, whose soul, remained elusive. It was a performance of indigeneity rather than an expression of it. There were subtle, almost imperceptible inaccuracies in her portrayal of specific, though vaguely attributed ceremonial practices, a glossing over of the harsh political and economic realities that shape so much of our existence, a pervasive romanticization that felt calibrated for an outsider's gaze, designed to confirm rather than challenge preconceived notions. But I had, with a sigh, dismissed it as the common, if regrettable, pitfalls of even well-intentioned, non-native writers attempting to navigate the treacherous terrain of our experiences. I hadn't, until that moment, suspected anything more calculated, more insidious. Anya's email was not just a spark, it was a fuse. It ignited a cold, creeping dread, a suspicion so monstrous, so deeply offensive, that I almost couldn't allow myself to give it form. With a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly, I rose from my desk and walked to the built-in bookshelves that lined my study. On the bottom shelf, tucked away behind newer, glossier volumes, I found it. My dusty, 20-year-old copy of Whispers of the Ancestors. Its cover, a simple, stark-line drawing of a raven in flight that I'd sketched myself, was faded, the cheap cardstock yellowed at the edges. The pages within were brittle, threatening to crack if handled too roughly. But the words, typed on an old electric typewriter and painstakingly laid out by hand, they were still alive. They still thrummed with the raw, unfiltered passion and pain of my younger self, a self that had poured her heart, her heritage, her hope, and her hurt onto those flimsy pages, believing, perhaps naively, in the power of words to bridge divides, to heal, to witness. Then, with that same trembling hand, with a growing sense of nausea, I opened. The initial discoveries were like small, sharp paper cuts, a strikingly similar turn of phrase here, a unique metaphor there, one I'd wrestled with for weeks, now presented as a spontaneous epiphany from Vance's muse. But as I delved deeper, comparing my fragile chapbook with her celebrated novel, the paper cuts became gaping wounds. It wasn't just a similar phrase or a shared theme, it was far more pervasive, more systemic, more chillingly deliberate. Entire descriptive passages in Shadow Walker's Legacy, lauded by critics for their evocative power and deeply spiritual imagery, mirrored, sometimes almost verbatim, sometimes with only the slightest cosmetic alteration, the imagery, the rhythms, the very sensory details from my poems. A central metaphor in one of my early short stories, the idea of personal and collective memory as a vast subterranean river, sometimes clear and life-giving, sometimes clouded with the silt of trauma and loss, but always inexorably flowing towards the sea of the collective unconscious, towards the ancestors. This very specific, deeply personal concept was a recurring motif in her novel, presented as a profound ancestral teaching she had received in dreams from her Cherokee grandmother. Specific idiosyncratic turns of phrase, unique juxtapositions of words that I had labored over, that had felt like direct transmissions from my own Diné worldview, from the landscape of Diné itself, were scattered throughout her polished prose like stolen jewels crudely reset in a gaudier, more commercially appealing setting. She hadn't just borrowed, she hadn't just been inspired, she had plundered, she had strip-mined my earliest, most vulnerable work, the intimate, sometimes unformed expressions of my Diné spirituality and lived experience. She had taken the raw, unpolished ore of my youthful offerings and smelted them down in the furnace of her ambition, recasting them into a shinier, more palatable, more marketable product, and all the while she had cloaked herself in the borrowed, ill-fitting, and ultimately fabricated regalia of an indigenous identity. The distant Cherokee grandmother narrative she so artfully peddled in every interview, every author Q&A, I now saw it with horrifying clarity for what it almost certainly was: a strategically deployed smokescreen, a convenient, unassailable shield of authenticity for her literary theft. It was a story that many in the predominantly white literary establishment were not only eager to believe, but actively desperate to celebrate. It fulfilled a certain narrative they craved: the assimilated, almost lost Indigenous person reconnecting with their roots, bringing forth ancient wisdom in a package that was still comfortably literary by their standards. The pretendian phenomenon, as we call it in Indian country, was not new. For generations, white individuals have donned feathers and beads, metaphorically or literally, claiming indigenous ancestry, often a conveniently distant and unverifiable Cherokee princess, to gain access to opportunities, to garner credibility, to profit financially and socially, to speak for us. Their voices, often amplified by systemic privilege, drowning out our own in the process. It is a particular insidious kind of violence, a theft not just of stories or resources, but of identity itself, of our sovereign right to define who we are, to tell our own histories, to control our own narratives. The anger that rose in me then was not the hot, explosive flash of typical outrage. It was a cold, sharp, diamond-hard fury, a deep, glacial rage that settled in my bones. This wasn't just about plagiarism, a recognized, if sometimes difficult to prove, literary crime. This was about cultural appropriation at its most cynical and egregious. This was about the ongoing colonization of our narratives, our spiritual traditions, our very being. Alara Vance hadn't just stolen my words, my metaphors, my deeply personal reflections. She had stolen a space, a platform, a spotlight that rightfully belonged to an Indigenous writer, perhaps one whose voice was still struggling to be heard, one who didn't have the privilege of a fabricated, romanticized backstory to sell to a hungry public. She was occupying our land, literarily speaking, reaping a rich harvest from seeds she had not sown, from soil she had not tilled, watered by the tears and experiences of others. My revenge, if that's what this necessary act of reclamation would become, couldn't be a simple lawsuit, a quiet cease and desist letter. Plagiarism of unpublished or little-known out-of-print works is notoriously, heartbreakingly, difficult to prove in a court of law, especially when the theft is clever, disguised with superficial alterations, presented as unconscious inspiration or mere thematic resonance. And a legal battle? would be financially ruinous, emotionally draining, and would inevitably be framed by her powerful publishers and PR machine as the bitter, jealous actions of a less successful, niche writer trying to ride the coattails of a literary superstar. They would try to discredit me, to diminish my work, to paint me as unhinged. No, my response had to be different. It had to be public. It had to be as meticulous, as undeniable, as the mountain of evidence I was now beginning to gather with a grim, methodical determination. For weeks, then months, I lived a strange, bifurcated existence. By day, I was Professor Althea Song Loya, delivering lectures on post-colonial theory, deconstructing the colonial gaze in literature, guiding my students through the complex, powerful works of Joy Harjo, Leslie Marmon Silko, N. Scott Momaday, Louise Erdrich, authentic Indigenous voices. I graded papers, attended faculty meetings, offered office hours. But by night, after my daughter was asleep, after the house was quiet, I transformed. I became a literary detective, a scholar of my own stolen past, hunched over my glowing computer screen, the rest of the world receding. I cross-referenced texts with a forensic intensity, highlighting passages in my old chapbook and in Vance's novels, creating spreadsheets documenting every instance of similarity, every telltale echo, every pilfered cadence. The parallels were staggering, far more extensive than I had even initially realized. It was like looking at a distorted reflection, my own features twisted into something almost unrecognizable, yet undeniably originating from me. I expanded my investigation beyond whispers of the ancestors. If she had plundered my work, had she done it to others? I started digging into Vance's background, searching for any verifiable genealogical link to the Cherokee Nation, or any indigenous nation for that matter. I consulted online databases, reached out to Cherokee Nation enrollment officials, discreetly, of course, and even hired a specialist in indigenous genealogy for a preliminary search. The distant grandmother, the cornerstone of her public persona, remained stubbornly, suspiciously elusive, a ghost in her carefully constructed, highly marketable machine. There were no records, no family stories from verifiable sources, only Vance's own vague, uncorroborated pronouncements in interviews.
The more I dug, the more brazen and calculated her entire enterprise appeared. It wasn't just whispers of the ancestors. I began to find subtle but distinct echoes of other early, obscure works by emerging or little-known native writers, phrases from poems published in small literary journals that had long since folded, paraphrased traditional stories that had been shared in small community newsletters or online forums, all subtly rephrased, decontextualized, repackaged, and presented as Alara Vance's unique literary vision, filtered through her rediscovered indigenous heritage. She was a literary cuckoo, laying her eggs in the nests of others, pushing out the rightful occupants. She was a connoisseur of the marginalized, a colonizer of the narrative frontier. The injustice of it all was a heavy, suffocating weight not just for myself, but for all indigenous writers, for all indigenous peoples, who struggle constantly for visibility, for respect, whose authentic voices are so often silenced, ignored, marginalized, or perhaps worse, exoticized and commodified. We fight for every inch of space in a literary landscape that, despite some progress, still largely views us through a colonial lens that often prefers its Indians tragic and historical, or safely assimilated and non-threatening, or as in Vance's case, presented by someone who looks the part, or can be styled to look the part, but offers a sanitized, palatable version of our complex realities. And here was a white woman, wearing a carefully constructed costume of indigeneity, occupying the very space we bled for, and being lavishly celebrated, richly rewarded for her deception. The decision to go public was not made lightly, not made in a fit of pique. It was a slow, agonizing calculus of risk and responsibility. I knew the potential personal and professional costs. I would be accused of envy, of bitterness, of trying to tear down a successful woman. The irony of that, given she was tearing down my work and the work of other Native women, was not lost on me. The literary establishment, which had invested so much prestige and capital in the Alara Vance myth, would likely close ranks, protect its asset. I might be blacklisted, my own career could suffer, but the alternative, to remain silent, to allow this monumental theft, this profound act of cultural violence, to stand unchallenged, was simply unbearable. It would be a betrayal of my ancestors, who fought and died for our survival and our stories. It would be a betrayal of my Diné community, which had entrusted me with its narratives. It would be a betrayal of every Indigenous writer, past, present, and future, who had ever dared to put their truth, their sacred words on paper. Duda, no. I could not stay silent.
I chose my weapon with the same meticulous care I had applied to gathering my evidence. Not a fiery op-ed, not a series of angry tweets, though the temptation for both was strong. Instead, I opted for a long-form, deeply researched and heavily documented blog post. It would be hosted on a respected online platform dedicated to Indigenous voices and scholarship. A space where it would be read first by those who understood the nuances and the stakes. I wouldn't just make accusations, I would lay out the evidence, piece by damning piece, irrefutably. Side-by-side comparisons of texts with highlighted passages, timelines demonstrating when my work was published versus when hers appeared. A careful academic analysis of the problematic ways Vance constructed and deployed her fabricated Indigenous identity. Citing scholars of Indigenous identity and cultural appropriation, I would strive for a tone of scholarly objectivity, though my heart ached with a quiet, profound sorrow and a burning, righteous indignation. The facts I knew, the cold, hard, documented facts, would speak for themselves, louder and more persuasively than any impassioned emotional plea. The title of the post, after much deliberation, was simple, direct, and I hoped resonant. Echoes in a Stolen Voice, a case of literary colonialism and fabricated identity. Before hitting publish, I took a crucial step. I shared the meticulously crafted draft and my supporting evidence with a small circle of trusted colleagues, other Native academics and writers whose integrity and judgment I respected, a couple of non-Native allies who were scholars of ethics and media, and, importantly, a lawyer specializing in intellectual property law and Indigenous cultural heritage rights. Their reactions were a validating, if sobering, mixture of profound shock, deep outrage at Vance's audacity, and unwavering, immediate support for my decision to speak out. They helped me refine the language for clarity and impact, double-check my citations, ensure the legal soundness of my claims, and, crucially, prepare for the inevitable storm of fallout. My lawyer friend, while cautioning about the limits of legal recourse for the plagiarism itself due to the obscurity of my early work, affirmed that the exposure of her fabricated identity was a matter of public interest and truth. The night I finally hit publish, the house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the frantic beating of my own heart. My daughter was asleep in her room, her breathing soft and even. The weight of my ancestors, of my community, felt palpable. My hand hovered over the mouse for a long, suspended moment. This was it. There was no turning back. This act would irrevocably change my life, for better or worse. I thought of my grandmother Elise, who faced down government agents trying to take her sheep during the livestock reduction, her small frame filled with an unyielding spirit. I thought of her quiet strength, her unwavering connection to truth and justice. I thought of the young Native writers I mentored at the university, their bright, hopeful faces, their urgent, vital stories waiting to be told. Stories that deserved to be heard without being overshadowed or co-opted. I took a deep breath, and I clicked. The internet, as they say, is a fickle and often brutal beast. A place of ephemeral outrage and fleeting attention, but sometimes, just sometimes, it can be a powerful, democratizing tool for justice. A digital fire that can burn away lies and illuminate truth. My blog post didn't just go viral in the way of a funny cat video. or a fleeting celebrity scandal. It detonated. It landed like a carefully aimed bomb in the pristine, often self-congratulatory gardens of the literary world. It was shared first, as I'd hoped, within Indigenous academic, literary, and activist circles across Turtle Island and beyond. From there, it was rapidly picked up by independent Native news outlets, then by progressive media organizations and blogs that had long been critical of cultural appropriation, and finally, reluctantly at first, then with a gathering sense of unavoidable obligation, it broke through to the mainstream literary press. The New York Times, The Guardian, NPR, the very institutions that had so enthusiastically trumpeted Alara Vance's arrival. The side-by-side textual comparisons were damning, impossible to ignore or explain away as mere coincidence. The sheer volume of echoes, the uncanny similarity of structure, imagery, and unique phrasing was overwhelming. My meticulous, if ultimately inconclusive, research into Vance's non-existent Cherokee ancestry added another crucial layer of irrefutable evidence to her calculated, multifaceted fraud. It wasn't just about borrowed words. It was about a borrowed life, a stolen identity. The hashtags, Alara Vance, literary fraud, cultural appropriation, stolen voice, pretendian, Native Twitter, trended for days. A digital storm of disbelief, anger, and calls for accountability. The initial reaction from Alara Vance's powerful publisher was predictable. A terse, dismissive statement about baseless and spurious allegations stemming from professional jealousy and an affirmation of their unwavering support for their brilliantly talented author. Vance herself remained conspicuously silent, retreating behind a formidable wall of high-priced publicists and lawyers. For a few days, it seemed as though the establishment might indeed close ranks, that the power of corporate publishing might succeed in quashing the inconvenient truth. But the evidence I had laid out was too compelling, too detailed, too systematically presented, and the public outcry, particularly from Indigenous communities and their allies, was too loud, too persistent, too morally resonant to be easily dismissed. Readers who had loved Shadow Walker's legacy, who had connected deeply with what they believed to be an authentic Indigenous voice, expressed profound feelings of betrayal, disillusionment, and anger. Book clubs canceled their discussions of her novel. Independent bookstores, those vital hubs of literary conscience, began to quietly pull her books from their Indigenous voices or recommended reading displays. Academics who had lauded her work in scholarly articles or invited her to speak at conferences issued embarrassed retractions or carefully worded, deeply uncomfortable reassessments. The awards committees that had honored her started to look very foolish, their vetting processes exposed as woefully inadequate. Then came the defections from within her own fortified camp. Her literary agent, a powerful figure known for discovering and nurturing major talents, quietly, without public comment, severed ties with her. Whispers, then credible reports, emerged from publishing insiders that her next lucrative multi-book deal had been indefinitely suspended, then cancelled. The carefully constructed glittering edifice of Alara Vance, literary sensation and self-proclaimed cultural ambassador, was beginning to visibly, irrevocably crumble. The revenge, and I use that word cautiously, for my primary motivation was truth, not vengeance, was not solely in witnessing her professional downfall, though I will not deny a certain grim, complex satisfaction in seeing a carefully constructed lie so thoroughly exposed, a system of appropriation so publicly challenged. The true, lasting victory was in the vital, far-reaching conversation that erupted from the ashes of her career. My blog post, the catalyst, became a touchstone for a much wider, much deeper, and long overdue public discussion about who gets to tell whose stories, about the ethics of representation and voice, about the persistent, damaging problem of pretendianism, the claiming of false Indigenous identity, and about the very real, tangible harm, emotional, cultural, professional, and economic, caused by cultural appropriation, especially when it involves members of a dominant culture profiting from the marginalized experiences and expressions of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous writers, scholars, artists, and activists seize the moment. Our voices, so often relegated to the footnotes or the periphery, were suddenly amplified, our perspectives sought out, our expertise finally taking center stage in a debate that had for too long been dominated by non-native academics and critics defining and often distorting our realities for us. Major media outlets, forced by the sheer scale of the scandal to cover it, also found themselves compelled to engage with these deeper, more complex issues. They interviewed Native authors who had been toiling in relative obscurity for years, whose authentic, brilliant works had been repeatedly overlooked by publishers chasing the next breakout, often white-authored, Indigenous story, while Vance's fabricated narrative soared to the top of bestseller lists. They explored the historical context of cultural theft, from land and resources to spiritual practices and stories. They began, however imperfectly, to grapple with the ongoing fight for Indigenous intellectual and cultural sovereignty. Alara Vance eventually, after weeks of damaging silence, issued a statement. It was not delivered in a tearful, contrite television interview, as some had speculated, but released through a new, less prestigious PR firm. It was a meandering, convoluted masterpiece of obfuscation, deflection, and carefully calibrated self-pity. It was filled with vague apologies for any unintentional hurt her work may have caused, and rambling, incoherent talk of complex ancestral journeys of the spirit, the universality of storytelling, and the fluidity of inspiration. There was no direct admission of plagiarism, no acknowledgement of her fabricated Cherokee identity, no genuine accountability. It was the non-apology apology of a narcissist caught in the glare of an unwelcome spotlight. It convinced no one who had actually read my post and examined the evidence. Her career as a celebrated author of authentic Indigenous experiences was unequivocally over. Her books were tainted, her name a byword for literary fraud, her credibility shattered beyond repair. For me, the personal and professional aftermath was complex, a whirlwind. There was profound relief, certainly, the lifting of an immense, solitary burden. There was also a deep, lingering exhaustion, the psychic toll of the preceding months of intense, isolating work and the subsequent public storm. And, unexpectedly, there was a renewed, almost overwhelming sense of purpose. The fight, I realized, wasn't just about one fraudulent author. It was about challenging and changing the systemic inequities, the colonial frameworks, that allowed such frauds to flourish in the first place. It was about creating more ethical, more equitable, more genuinely inclusive spaces for authentic Indigenous voices to be heard, honored, and celebrated on their own terms. The stolen voice scandal, as it inevitably came to be known in headlines, didn't magically solve all the problems of injustice and inequality in the literary world, or in the wider society. Of course not. The roots of colonialism run too deep for that. But it was a significant crack in the wall, a moment of profound disruption and, dare I hope, transformation. Publishers, for a time at least, became demonstrably more cautious, more inclined to rigorously vet claims of Indigenous identity, more genuinely open to acquiring, publishing, and promoting actual Native writers. Readers became more critical, more discerning, more aware of the politics of representation. The conversation started, then continued to reverberate. I didn't seek out the intense media spotlight that followed my blog post. I gave a few carefully considered interviews, always striving to redirect the focus from my personal grievance to the larger systemic issues, always endeavoring to highlight the brilliant work of other Indigenous creators. The real revenge, the most profound and lasting victory, was this: the echoes of my once stolen words. Words that had been used to build a false idol and a fraudulent career were now an integral part of a much larger, resonant chorus demanding truth, respect, and literary justice. The whispers of my ancestors, the stories rooted in my Diné heritage, which Alara Vance had so callously attempted to appropriate and commodify as her own, were now being heard, loud and clear in their authentic forms and in the powerful, unapologetic, unbowed voices of a new and expanding generation of Indigenous storytellers. The earth, Unchimaka, truly doesn't lie, and neither do the stories that spring from her, from our connection to her, if they are told with an honest heart, with respect by those to whom they truly, spiritually, culturally belong. My grandmother Elise, with her quiet wisdom and her hands in the soil, knew that with every fiber of her being. And now, perhaps, the wider world, or at least a significant part of it, was beginning, finally, to understand it too. The fight for our stories, for our voices, for our truth continues. It always will. But today, the whispers are a little stronger, the echoes a little clearer, and the path ahead, while still undeniably challenging, feels a little more illuminated by the unwavering, reclaimed light of our own narratives. And that is a victory worth every scar.